Okay, Swan Shootout Radio is officially go. I'm Mouse,
And this is Hayate.
and this is a show where we're going to focus on discussing Japanese video games, particularly games that a lot of people might not be aware of or may have overlooked. So a lot of these are going to be Japan exclusive games that weren't released outside or weren't translated. And I've been studying Japanese for about 5 years on and off. Although I know you're more fluent than I am. When did you start learning Japanese?
I started learning Japanese back in 2014. I was already studying college at the time, but I had enough time during my travel to school to focus on getting everything down, and I've been playing lots of games since then and just learning as I go.
So the two of us are obviously really passionate about Japanese video games, and we hope that we can kind of communicate to people who maybe haven't studied Japanese but are interested in some of these obscure games that aren't translated, to kind of say what they're all about. And
since there doesn't really exist much information about the games we plan to talk about, so we really want to drive home the point that you can learn about the games here and maybe get some interest.
Absolutely. So the name of the show is Swan Shootout Radio. It's a reference to an event in Metal Max 2, which is an old Super Famicom game.
One of our favorite franchises.
One of our favorites, for sure. It's a great series. And in this game, there's a big cruise ship shaped like a swan, and you can go to this cruise ship and go on the head of the swan and have a one-on-one Wild West style shootout with a cyborg who wears a sombrero and a poncho, and you can get his poncho as a drop if you're lucky. It's a very quintessential Metal Max kind of scenario where it meshes together Wild West and science fiction and post-apocalyptic and everything.
And punching barrels.
Yeah. And we thought it'd be a good name for the show since it also includes Swan in the title. And that kind of alludes to the kind of games that we're going to be talking about, like WonderSwan games, which
today's episode we'll be focusing on a WonderSwan game.
Yeah, absolutely. We are focusing on a WonderSwan game today. Although throughout the radio show we're going to move on to games from all kinds of platforms and time periods. But I think WonderSwan is sort of emblematic of the types of games that we're probably going to cover. So before we get into Terrors, which is our first game that we're focusing on here, we're going to do a little segment where we talk about things that we've been playing recently and just give a brief overview of that just to get chatting. Did you want to go first?
Sure. Well, lately I've been focusing more on getting better at Money Idol Exchanger, which is one of my favorite games. But I've also been playing a couple little games that have piqued my interest. One of which is Daisuke's for arcade, which is a Konami party game in which you have a total of 8 characters, 4 men and 4 woman characters. And you can... The main point of this game is to choose one of the characters to get to fall in love with you, and you confess at the end of the game through various mini games. You get to connect with that character, and other player might try to steal that person from you. So you want to beat every minigame, which range from matching minigames to rhythm video games to quiz games and such. And one of the interesting points of this game is that it doesn't really say anything if you play a female character and decide to go after a female character, and likewise if you play a male character and want to confess to a male character. The game just plays it straight, and it gets pretty funny dialogue. Yeah.
I've never heard of it. When did it come out?
I'm not sure, but I think it was in the early 90s or something.
Early 90s?
Or mid 90s, actually. Now that I think of it, I think it was 96.
96.
Yeah.
Okay. Lately, I've been playing Rejoice Aretha Okoku no Kanata, which means like Beyond the Kingdom of Aretha for the Super
Mm-hmm.
Famicom. This was, I think, the last game in the Aretha series, which started on the Game Boy. And up until that point, all the Aretha games had been turn-based RPGs. But for this one, they made an action RPG with co-op multiplayer, kind of like Secret of Mana.
Mm-hmm.
So in this game, all the action is sort of like top-down shooting. You have different magic attacks that you can get, and some of these will be like shooting in a V shape or having an orb circle around your character and so on. And you can pick one that sort of fits your playstyle. And the action is so-so, like it's passable as an action game, but not particularly great. Although what kind of stood out to me is that the game has a lot of personality in its dialogue and its story. So the main of the game is named Demon Lord Howard, and Howard is pretty much the best name for a demon lord I can think of. And he's got a minion named Ice Cube, who is literally an ice cube. And there's music with like record scratching in the game, which I didn't expect to see on any Super Famicom game. And you're playing as like a group of rebellious teenagers who, in the opening cutscene, they light a guy's house on fire and then help him put it out. Two of them help him put it out to distract him, while the other two run in and steal from him. It's a really wild, sort of off-the-wall adventure, and there's a lot of charming dialogue and personality in there. It's a little bit hard to recommend for the action alone, but certainly if you like Secret of Mana and you have a friend who you like to play action RPGs with,
it sounds like
you're not going to find much else.
Sorry, it sounds like it should also appeal to those people who are into quirky RPGs over those with deeper gameplay, like something like the Mother series, or it also got me thinking about Gokijo Bokentai on the SNES.
Oh yeah.
Well, so it sounds interesting.
The gameplay is pretty easy, and there's also multiple difficulty modes if you want to make it like super simple and just play for the story. Honestly, I played on normal. I found it wasn't too bad, but if you want to play on easy, I wouldn't really fault you for that, because the story, for me at least, was the appeal more so than the action. So yeah, that's kind of pretty much what Rejoice is all about.
I've also never heard of it, but sounds pretty interesting.
The series had like 6 games, but then I think it just died right after that.
Yeah, I've heard the name Arita before, but I haven't really looked into these games.
They were developed by Japan Art Media, which was kind of an obscure developer.
Yeah.
Okay. With that, do you want to move on to Terrors?
Yeah, I think it's fine. Let's move on to Terrors. So this game.
Yeah, so Terrors came out for the WonderSwan on August 5th, 1999, which is about 5 months after the WonderSwan itself had come out. This game is a sound novel, and for those who aren't familiar, sound novel it's kind of an obscure term nowadays, because visual novel has basically replaced it. Especially in the West, people refer to all Japanese novel games as visual novels now. But back in the 90s, the term sound novel existed before the term visual novel had even been invented. And it was coined by Chunsoft to describe their novel games, starting with Otogiri So on the Super Famicom. And it eventually got applied to a number of games that came out on consoles around that time and sort of copied what Chunsoft was doing. And even today, despite visual novel becoming the more predominant term, sound novel still sort of applies to games within that niche that sort of focus on atmosphere, particularly through audio, as the sound in the sound novel implies. And these games generally use digitized photographs instead of hand-drawn artwork that you see in visual novels, like the anime style. Most sound novels use real photographs with real actors, or They might use silhouettes like in Kamatachi no Yoru. So the sound novel scene was actually fairly prolific back in the 90s on the Super Famicom and then Saturn and the PlayStation. But there weren't many on handheld systems because these games are all text, and reading text on a handheld is not ideal. But the WonderSwan came. Sorry, go ahead.
The term was also trademarked by Chunsoft, right? Like not
every
company
they trademarked it.
Mm-hmm.
They trademarked it, but I don't know how long that really lasted or how other companies skirted around it, because I know there was Sound Novel Maker on the Super Famicom and then on the PlayStation, which is a terrible game.
That was made by ASCII, right?
Yeah, it was made by ASCII, and you can make your own sound novel, but you can only use controller inputs. There's no keyboard accessory, so it takes you like hours to actually write anything. So,
well, sounds like idea. A good novelty, if anything.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, there weren't many sound novels on handheld systems, but the WonderSwan came around, and it was a fairly underpowered console. It was very bad with action games. You had a lot of slowdown. The screen would get really blurry when you scroll, but it could handle kanji, and the cartridges could store a lot of data, so you could have digitized photographs on it. So it was kind of the ideal system for bringing novel games onto handhelds.
And Terrace does a great job of using the handheld format for its stories.
Yeah, it does, for sure. So when this game came out, it had two versions, one for 3,000 yen, which was the standard version, and another for 4,000 yen, which came with a headphone adapter, because the WonderSwan was super cheap. It didn't have a headphone jack. And so the headphone adapter was mainly let the user have a better audio experience, because the built-in speaker on the WonderSwan is garbage. It sounds okay for like actual chip music, but this game uses a lot of digitized audio, and it has partial voice acting, oddly enough. So the headphones certainly help with that. And when I first played this, I played it on a real WonderSwan without a headphone adapter, because they're pretty hard to get nowadays. And the voices they're constantly crackling out of the speaker because it can't actually handle the data that's stored on the cartridge. It can't produce the sounds properly, which does give it like a sort of interesting vibe when you're hearing this like crackling scream coming out of the speaker in the middle of a scenario.
Yeah, for sure. I played it in an emulator, so I didn't have much trouble in that regard, but I still found it very enjoyable in that sense. The audio aspect of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of environmental sound effects, things like cicadas chirping, or the sound of a heartbeat. When the protagonist gets scared, you usually hear their heartbeat.
I was pretty bummed to learn that there exists no rip of the audio files on the internet, since there was one ambient track that I really liked that played during the most anxiety-filled parts of each scenario, and I wanted to listen to it separately, but no one has ripped the audio files for this game, and apparently it's pretty hard to rip WonderSwan files. You have to have very deep knowledge about the systems.
I've never really looked into that. The WonderSwan could handle some pretty advanced audio for a system at the time, and especially considering how cheap it was. Like they really skimped out on certain areas of the WonderSwan's hardware, but on other areas it's fairly powerful, especially with its ability to handle still images. You could have some fairly high quality images. Like obviously there were limitations with the system itself, because it's black and white, and it could only handle I think 8 shades of gray on the screen at a time. But for a horror game, I think that actually works to its advantage to some extent, because it takes these digitized photographs in terrors, and it sort of downsizes them to this black and white, low resolution, 8 shades of gray version. And in horror, certainly the fear of the unknown is one of the strongest fears that we have as humans. And when you take a photo and you reduce the visual fidelity that much, I think it adds to the fear of the unknown. And a lot of the visuals and terrors, they're so hard to see what it is you're looking at, or it takes you a few seconds to sort of register what you're looking at. And in that time period where you're trying to figure out what's actually going on, it adds to that fear of the unknown, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps intentionally, but the end result is actually very impactful, I feel.
Yeah, even the writing can be kind of hard to make sense of at times, I feel.
Yeah, it really squeezes the kanji in with the low resolution.
Yeah,
and it's a very dark game too. Like the screen is extremely black, black and gray. That's all you're looking at the whole time. And it's even more so on the real hardware.
Yeah.
Compared to an emulator, because like it's not a black backlit system, so you have to like hold it in the light at the right angle and adjust the contrast just to see what it is you're looking at. Yeah, so that aspect for me was a big draw of this game. I know certainly in among horror film enthusiasts, there's a lot of people who enjoy horror films that are low fidelity, and they'll like collect horror films on VHS, because the artifacts and distortion in VHS tapes it kind of adds to the experience. And I feel like we don't have that same culture in video games. It exists to some extent, like in the old Silent Hill games, they had a filter that was automatically on that added like a grainy effect, and you could turn it off in the settings, but it was on by default to sort of distort the screen. But for the most part, we don't have the same cult interest in like low fidelity horror in video games that we have in film.
I saw someone on a Japanese site call it one of the ultimate atmosphere games or something to that effect, and I'm inclined to agree.
It's certainly a very extreme. Well, it's extremely lo-fi. Let's just put it at that. It's extremely lo-fi, and that might not appeal to everybody, but if you like lo-fi horror, you probably won't find anything that does it in a more extreme way than this. Yeah. So in this game, there's 5 main scenarios that are available from the start. Those are like separate stories, and they were each written by a different writer. And you can play through these 5 scenarios in any order. And after you beat each of them once, it unlocks a final 6th scenario. And combined between these 6 scenarios, there's over 40 different endings.
Yeah.
And I found that when I replayed some of them, some of the early choices could dramatically change the story. Not for all of them, but certainly for some of them, I got like a totally different story from the start.
Yeah. From the second chapter onwards, the branching gets pretty complicated.
I found for the sequel, Terrorist 2, I was able to find some pictures from the official strategy guide where they had the like flow charts, and it's like super complex how much it branches, and especially with the TerraPoint system, which we'll get into a little bit later. That sort of makes figuring out the branching paths even more complicated than usual for a novel game. So each of these scenarios, they're pretty short, right? I think like 30 to 60 minutes at the most, maybe.
Yeah, at the most.
At the most.
I don't think 60 minutes is kind of long. I think more 30 minutes. Yeah, 30 minutes.
30 minutes, yeah. So you can get through them each in one sitting. Do you want to go through them?
Getting the good endings is another story. It can be pretty tough.
It can be pretty tough. There's actually a system in place that I'll talk about a little bit later that makes it easier to get the good endings on repeat playthroughs. I just found out about this fairly recently.
Let's go through these scenarios.
Yeah, let's go through them one by one.
Yeah. So the first scenario is, I think it's called Unreal Ryokan. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's about a travel inn, like a haunted travel inn. Do you want to basically explain the premise?
Well, it's about a guy that travels to a small village and meets a girl who ran away from home, and they end up in a what you call it, an inn, which is haunted.
Yeah. It's a pretty basic,
pretty standard
story.
horror story.
Aside from the fact that there's a little bit of mystery about the girl, and you kind of learn a little bit about her backstory as you get further in the scenario. But I felt like that was kind of the most vanilla of the five. The second one is about I don't remember what it was called. I didn't write that down. I'm sorry.
It's called Itoshiki Tomo, or Dear Friend.
Yeah, Dear Friend. That's about a girl living with a roommate in an apartment, and one of their neighbors has been playing really loud music every night. So she starts writing letters to her neighbor, asking him to stop, and he says that it's his friend who's living with him, and he's been trying to get him to stop, but it hasn't really been working out. And over time, I don't really want to spoil too much, but they start seeing some more disturbing things around their apartment, which they sort of link to this guy in the other apartment, and that culminates in an unsettling scenario that plays out.
It's interesting to me because this is more of a Ryaru or realistic horror story compared to the previous one. So from the second chapter, you are already getting variety in the style of horrors that you will see across the game.
Yeah. The third one was Chisana Ubakayashiki.
Yeah, another standard day horror story in a sense.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. There's a young girl and her two friends from school decide to go to a haunted amusement house, and they find out that the attractions at that house are more realistic than they kind of bargained for. I
really like some of the imagery in this. In some of the scenes in this one.
I find that in general with these these stories, because they're so short, it tends to jump pretty quickly from one scene to the next, and there's there's always something happening. And with some of the other scenarios, I found it didn't work very well, or not as well as I'd hoped, because I tend to like slower writing, where the characters are able to kind of reflect on what's been happening, and you have those quieter moments. But in this scenario, because they're just going through a haunted amusement house and they're going from one attraction to the next, it actually kind of worked pretty well. Even though it's not one of my favorites, it certainly used that short style to its advantage. So as they go through the house, the girl's friends get captured, and she has to try to kind of find them while escaping from the house.
The fourth one is, I forgot its name, but it's translated as creaking sound.
Yeah, I think it was Kishimu Oto.
Oto, yeah.
Yeah.
So this one has a pretty interesting premise.
Yeah. This was probably my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
So a young guy, university age, and his girlfriend go to visit this guy's ill grandfather, and it gets far-fetched pretty quickly, but the grandfather dies in a very strange manner. I guess it's not too much of a spoiler at this point, but
Yeah.
His grandfather was a puppeteer who made karakuri puppets, which are like Japanese puppets, and he how do you say this? He sort of used some dark magic or dark science of some sort to create living puppets.
Mm-hmm.
And the protagonist of the scenario discovers that he is actually a karakuri puppet that was made by his grandfather. And if anyone discovers that he is a karakuri puppet, then he'll die. His heart will like self-destruct or something like that.
Mm-hmm. So this is a pretty interesting horror fantasy story, but I think it pulls it off very well. Yeah.
Yeah. The interesting thing about this one is the
psychological aspect, right?
Well, pardon?
Mm-hmm. The psychology.
Yeah, the psychological aspect, and also I think the fact that the protagonist is so worried about other people finding out that a lot of the horror comes from like the things that he considers doing to stop people from finding out. And so in a lot of horror, there's a fear of the other, but in this case, it's more a fear of the self sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And it's a really interesting scenario, very far-fetched premise, but there's a lot of interesting internal dilemmas that the protagonist goes through. So yeah, that one was personally my favorite. And the fifth was called Mother Table.
Yeah, it's actually one of my favorites, and so I think the reception of it could be quite polarizing, as the horror aspect on this one is a bit more subdued, I guess you could say. Okay. It centers more around the female protagonist and her living conditions and her boyfriend.
I actually had two very different experiences with this one with the first time I played it and the second.
Oh yeah.
Because you get a choice very early on. Okay. Well, the premise of this one is a girl named Yoko and her boyfriend Kaoru are at school, and they meet after school, and Kaoru says that he has to go to the library for something. He can't walk home with her. So you have a choice at the start of following him to the library or going to the pool for your club activities. And depending on that initial choice, it actually results in a very different story. And the first time I went to the library, and I don't know how much I want to talk about what happens, but like
yeah, that's fine.
It results in a very uncomfortable
story,
a very very different story and a situation that I found very uncomfortable to read. So that scenario, it just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. But then the other time I went to the pool, and that started like a totally different scenario where you kind of get drawn back in time into like the old school building.
Yeah.
And there's this whole there's this like ghost of a girl named Mariko who seems to have some connection to the protagonist Yoko, and it's a lot more interesting. You sort of figure out a little bit about Mariko's past and her family, and I thought that branch of the story was one of the best in the game. Yeah, but the other one I just couldn't read.
Yeah, that's understandable. So after you get through these 5 main scenarios, you unlock a final scenario, which is a much more surreal and confusing story than the rest of them. But I think it also carries a lot of strength in its writing.
Yeah. It's very dreamlike in that the connection from one scene to the next is basically non-existent. It's almost indiscernible.
Yeah.
It's very surreal, and the things that you see in the scenario and the way that it ends are actually based on the endings that you got in the other 5 scenarios. So it sort of culminates all of that in a surreal conclusion.
Mm-hmm. It's a pretty cool way to end the game, to be honest, in my opinion.
So as you're going through these scenarios, like most novel games, you have choices that you can make, which will branch the story in different directions. But there's also an invisible parameter. I guess it's not entirely invisible.
Yeah,
but
there's.
So the developers implemented a system called terror points, and essentially, well, actually, I can read it straight from the manual here because there's scans of the manual online. So here's what it says. テラポイントとは物語の主人公がどれだけ恐怖を感じているかを表すパラメータです。So, terror points are a parameter which represents how scared the protagonist is feeling. And I know I have a terrible accent when I read Japanese, but I don't really get a lot of opportunities to speak, you know. So it goes on to say. It goes on to say. Yeah, it goes on to say. このポイントは選んだ選択肢によって上下し、この変化はストーリーの分岐に影響を与えます。So, these points go up and down depending on the choices that you make, and this change in the parameter will affect the branching of the story. このポイントが一定値を超えてしまうと、恐怖を感じる選択肢を選んでも、主人公は指示に逆らう行動を取ることがあります。And this is kind of a really interesting point about the terror point system. If the points go over a certain value, then if you choose a scary, you make a scary selection in the game, the protagonist might ignore that and do something else because he or she is too afraid to follow your directions. 主人公の取った行動が恐ろしければ恐ろしいほどポイントは大幅に上昇します。プレイヤーは主人公の行動をうまく指示しながら物語の真実を見極めてください。So the scarier the actions of the protagonist, the more your terror points will increase. So as the player, you should carefully guide the protagonist through the story in order to find the truth or the true ending. And there's one last point here, which is really interesting. It says, 2回目以降のプレイは同じ恐怖を受けてもポイントの変化量が少なくなります。So when you replay a scenario and you see the same scary thing, it doesn't scare the protagonist as much, and so your terror points don't increase as much as they would on a first playthrough. And so that is a way that it becomes easier to get the good endings as you replay the game.
Yeah.
Because the terror points stop increasing as much once you've played it multiple times.
It's a pretty interesting mechanic to incorporate into a sound level game, which is one of the main reasons I like the game so much.
Yeah. And I think the sound novel scene in the 90s in general was really interesting because of the ways that they tried to incorporate or they tried to make use of the video game medium in ways that you couldn't in like a choose your own adventure book. And that's something that was present as early as Otogiri So, which had had more choices become available as you replayed the game. and that would like branch the story differently, and you would end up with scenes that like make reference to things that have happened in previous playthroughs. And Otogiri gets like more and more into metafiction as you play the game multiple times. And I think incorporating parameters like terror points is something that the developers of this game were really passionate about. And in the sequels, they actually added more parameters. Like Terrorist 2 has 3 different parameters.
It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and it gets really complicated with the flowcharts and everything.
Yeah. I also like the way it is presented visually. Through waves on the screen.
Yeah, when you see something scary, there's a wave effect that shows up on screen in between the text and the pictures.
Depending on the choice, yeah, the terror
depending
might be
on the
more
choice, yeah. And also, like even outside of the choices, sometimes if there's like something suddenly scary happens, you see the waves appear.
Mm-hmm.
And
very cool touch.
Yeah. So speaking of sequels, this game had one direct sequel which came out in December of 2000 called Terrorist 2, and this was a game that was compatible with both the WonderSwan color, like it had full color support, and you could also play it on a black and white WonderSwan. But before that, it had a spiritual successor called Ring Infinity, which is based on the Ring franchise. And this game also used the TerraPoint system. It was, I assume it was made by the same developers. It's definitely another game by Bandai.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most people are who like Japanese horror have probably seen the film, The Ring, which is about like a cursed videotape. It was very popular around that time. And the last successor was called Last Alive, which came out in July of 2001. And this wasn't a horror game. It was more of a suspense story. Apparently, it's based on a TV drama that was airing around that time. Mm-hmm. But I don't really know much more about it. All of these games used real actors for the voice acting and the photographs. I guess you can't really see the people in the photographs and terrors because it's just so lo-fi. Like there are some images where you see people, but you can't really make out their faces very well. Mm-hmm. But that was kind of a selling point of the game, is that they had real actors, and a lot of them were teenage idols. Yeah.
And the ending theme was sung by Reiko Omori.
Yeah. And she stars in the first scenario with the inn. Yeah. So this is Terrors, I think, is a pretty interesting game in the WonderSwan library. Being one of the few sound novels that were out on handhelds at the time, it certainly found a way to make use of the limited visual and audio fidelity of the system to its advantage. And for people who like lo-fi horror or very atmospheric games or stories, this is something that's worth checking out. I think you liked it more than I did, though, right?
Yeah, I really like like you said, you feel like the writing doesn't really set the sense of dread that you might want from a horror game, right?
Mm-hmm. Because it's so fast-paced.
Yeah, but I also think the writing and some of the more the whole direction with the visuals, the audio, and the stories themselves, I think worked really well for me.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
I certainly appreciated the atmosphere and the visuals and all of that was really good. I wish there was more.
Yeah.
Like if the scenarios were like double the length,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it would kind of appeal to me more. But it was just going so fast a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I have to wonder if there's ever going to be a translation scene for some of these old novel games. And I've seen there's one person who does like live translations on YouTube.
Oh.
Like she plays through sound novel games and she reads them out loud in English.
Mm-hmm.
But it's probably really, really difficult to actually insert the text into these, which is unfortunate.
And there isn't really much knowledge about them in English because there is a pretty big scene in Japan.
Yeah. Like people know sound novels a lot more in Japan, especially some of the more popular ones like Kamatachi no Yoru or Machi. Machi, I think, was famously listed in like Famitsu Reader's top 10 games of all time back about 10 years ago. But none of these ever made it outside Japan because of all the localization work and the risk involved in translating something, which is kind of sad. But
and even if games like Kamaitachi no Yoru or Otogrizo get more
exposure
in the West, I think Terrors will remain unknown for a long time.
Yeah, I don't think it's a game for everybody.
Yeah,
but it has such a unique look and sound and atmosphere that is just the most extremely low fidelity horror game you're ever gonna find.
That's for sure.
So I think I've covered everything I wanted to touch on with this game. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No. I feel like if I really want to go more about it, it could be kind of spoilery. So I think it's good to leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to ruin some of the endings because there are some really interesting ending scenarios that play out. So if this does sound like your thing, check it out. Terrors. And I think that'll pretty much do it for our first episode of Swan Shootout Radio. Neither of us have ever done a podcast before, so we were a little bit nervous going into this, but thank you for listening. And if you have any feedback, please let us know. We'd certainly like to hear it. Questions, comments, anything you have to say. And we have plans to kind of expand this in future episodes by adding more segments, sort of spicing things up so it's not just talking about one game. We also want to focus on like developer profiles and other things to keep it informative and entertaining. Yep.
Well, thanks for listening.
And take care. We'll see you next time.
See you.